What's up, everybody? I'm Jason and welcome back to the channel. Now, if you've looked around in the filmmaking space for any length of time, you've probably seen somebody using a gimbal somewhere. Heralded as the tool to deliver buttery smooth handheld shots with any camera and not needing to have a Steadicam rig and all kinds of complicated stuff. The question is, do they really deliver on that? And what's the deal behind them? And what's a good one? And which one did I get? Well, maybe you're not asking the last question. So in my recent time-lapse video project, I talked about doing time-lapses using the time-lapse mode found on DJI's RS3 Pro gimbal, and I promised a more thorough review would be coming. Well, I'm not sure if I would call this a review, but it is certainly my take on the RS3 Pro that I have. So with that said, let's get this show on the road. And the first question that you might be asking and that I want to actually tackle answering is, why DJI? And this is where I feel like a lot of people will craft some line about deliberating over all the pros and cons of every piece of equipment on the market or something like that. Or alternatively, this is where they say that this is a sponsored video. DJI gave it to them. DJI did not give this to me. I bought it with my own money, and the truth is, I didn't really deliberate over all of the equipment that's on the market either. For better or worse, what I ended up doing was pointing my browser at the brand that I perceived as being the best regarded or well regarded, and then picked a model that met my other needs based on what I kind of needed. Now, I know that's not a satisfying answer, and lots of people would absolutely argue that you shouldn't do that. In fact, I would say you shouldn't do that either. However, looking back, this did work out for the best in my situation, and unfortunately, given the dearth of equipment that is coming out on the market now for basically everything, where there's a million different brands that are competing, it's getting really hard, at least for me, to look at every possible alternative that's out there and try and evaluate it. So the next question then might be, why the RS3 Pro and not one of DJI's other models? Now the answer to that is both more nuanced and a lot more logical. My two primary considerations when I was looking for a gimbal was capacity, how much I could put on it, and cost. I didn't want to spend a fortune, and that unfortunately ruled out companies like FreeFly and their Movi, and for that matter, the higher-end DJI Ronin 2 as well. Now, for capacity, I wanted to be able to fly a gripped R5 or an R5C with an external battery, plus a reasonably big lens. So for me, that's either a 24-70 f2.8 or preferably in some cases, or at least this was my thought process at the time, a 28-70 f2. Now, that alone is about 5 to 6 pounds of gear. So looking at DJI's line of RS3 gimbals, well, the Mini was out immediately due to capacity. It only is like 4 and change pounds, and that's less than like the lens that I'm trying to fly. That left the RS3 and RS3 Pro. Now the RS3 has a rated capacity of about 6.4 pounds, which might have worked, probably would have worked, but I thought it was tight, which pushed me to the RS3 Pro, which extends that capacity to 10 pounds. So I would have my 5 or 6 pounds of gear and a little bit of margin to work with. So that was the sizing. RS3 Pro, there it goes. Now, that said, after having gotten it, size, weight, and capacity are really important things in ways that I really didn't appreciate before I started using the gimbal. So the RS3 Pro, the gimbal unit alone, the motors and all of that weighs in at 2.5 pounds or 1.14 kilograms. However, that isn't the full working configuration. In the full working configuration with the briefcase grip, the extended grip handle, the battery grip handle part that you actually need to power all of it, basically all of that stuff, we are now looking at something that's more like 3.84 pounds or 1.74 kilograms. Now, to put this in perspective, the gimbal setup, or that gimbal setup fully configured, weighs about as much as your traditional 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens. Now, on top of the camera and lenses, there are some other things that you might want to end up flying, and this is part of the reason why I wanted some margin. DJI has their Ronin image transmitter, which provides wireless monitoring through your smartphone and enables subject tracking. They also have a LiDAR rangefinder, which does subject tracking as well as providing focus control over their focus motors so that you can do autofocus essentially with manual focus cinema lenses. Now, all that said, be very mindful of the weight of your gimbal and gear. This is the takeaway that I have had from this. There is a physical strength component, and it's a fairly significant one if you could say that, to operating these kinds of mid-range gimbals and certainly higher-end gimbals as well. And keep in mind, what we're not talking about here is, oh, I can go to the gym and curl 40 pounds. We're talking about a long-duration isometric lift. You're going to be holding 10, maybe 15 pounds at most, or something in that range, out in front of you in often awkward positions for a long period of time, however long your shot is. That could be, certainly it could be short, like 30 seconds, but it could be minutes on end as well. So given that, I would argue that you want to right-size your gimbal as much as possible. Don't just buy the biggest one you can find. I'd also seriously recommend re-evaluating just how badly you want to fly big, heavy lenses and cameras. Obviously, the less weight, the lighter it is, the easier it is to deal with. One other reason that you might want to consider a smaller gimbal is size. And this is something that I did not appreciate really at all until I started trying to pack my RS3 Pro in a backpack to take it on a trip with me. Without the battery/handle unit, the gimbal folds down to around 11.25 by 9.5 by 2.5 inches, which doesn't really fit in most backpacks that only have about 7 or 8 inches of depth available. Yeah, you could put it in flat, but then it's big and it just doesn't really work. While I'm sure there are backpacks out there that this will fit nicely in, it is not any of my think tank or f-stop gear bags. So that is something to be aware of or consider if you are going to go this route. Now, all that said, dropping down a step to the RS3 doesn't actually save that much size or weight off the stowed package. Now, the Mini will get you down to under 8 inches when it is collapsed and stowed, which will fit, or at least is closer to what fits in many backpacks, but it may not fit in most or all anyway. Now, I had mentioned that the grip is removable. And the grip is also the battery for the gimbal. And quite honestly, I think this is pretty smart design on DJI's part. First, because it means you can replace the battery when it dies without replacing the whole thing. Now, okay, a more standard removable grip setup might have been better. You know, a regular kind of battery, or battery setup, I should say. You know, a regular battery that you could put into the grip and so on. But at least this is a reasonable compromise between having to chuck an entire gimbal because its battery died versus having a reasonable amount of waste when the battery gets to end of life. However, the more interesting part of the separate battery grip power solution is how this allows for different power sources and mounting options should you choose to go this way. And this is a feature that I find very strongly in favor for the RS3 Pro. Now, between DJI's first-party accessories and the plethora of options out there from third parties like Small Rig and Tilta, and that's just to name a few, there are a ton of options available for customizing, mounting, powering, and so forth your RS3 Pro. And of course, we are not just talking about mounting, but handles, ring grips, remote controls, alternate quick release places, and so on. And this is an ecosystem that I think is really nice to have and really important as well. Now, speaking of accessories, one thing that I feel like I would have liked to have in the box is a more traditional side-by-side style grip. That said, adding a side-by-side kind of grip solution is a bit of a rabbit hole to go down. Small rig sells what looks like a reasonable kit for about $100. DJI has pretty much the same thing for like $135. But in both of those cases, you have to use the main grip controls to start and stop the camera, point the gimbal or point the camera, and so on and so forth. Now, Small Rig does sell a wireless remote grip that you could use instead, but as far as I can tell from looking at the pictures and the marketing material on it, it lacks the dial that is found on the DJI grip. DJI, of course, sells a grip control or a wired external grip control that does have all of the controls, including the dial, but it is $350, which is a bit more expensive than Small Rig's. Plus, none of that comes with the rails that you need to mount it to be able to use it. So a bit of a rabbit hole. Now, that said, the other huge positive for the RS3 that I did not consider at all when I was buying it, and I'm glad I ended up where I did, is the remote mount capabilities. So DJI sells a remote mount kit for the RS3 that you can use to mount it, or the RS3 Pro, that you can use to mount it on a crane or a car rig or any other kind of structure that has some bolt holes. This also includes DC power inputs and remote control inputs so that you can both power it without having to worry about using the grip, as well as controlling it and so forth. What this ultimately means is that this one gimbal can do everything from being a handheld thing to putting it on a crane where you're using it just basically as a head, to mounting it to a car or a boat or whatever, which this amount of flexibility, quite honestly, is incredibly good for a low-budget filmmaker. Now, with that said, I want to cycle back to the battery situation for a second, because the battery is rated for 12 hours of use, and this actually seems quite reasonable. I haven't specifically tested this, but it definitely outlasts me when I'm using the gimbal over the course of several days. So I feel like 12 hours seems relatively reasonable, all things considered. To recharge the battery, you use a USB-C port and cable at the front of the battery grip. It is capable of taking up to 24 watts from either a QC2 or USB power delivery charger. All told, it takes about an hour and a half to fully charge from being fully discharged. Moreover, if you happen to run the battery down in the middle of a shoot, as best as I can tell, you can power the system, recharge the battery, etc. from the USB-C port when you're using it. Now, that said, all positive, DJI has a number of, let's call them, recommendations for how to manage, optimize, and use the battery. First, they recommend that when storing the gimbal for 10 days or more, you discharge the battery between 40 and 60% and remove it from the gimbal unit. Now, removing it from the unit is easy. It's flip a switch or lever, push a button, it pops off. However, discharging it to that specific range, well, that isn't that easy. Second, they say for travel, and by which travel I assume they mean air travel, the grip should be just charged to below 30% of battery life. Now, that's kind of an odd requirement. I haven't seen that anywhere else, but of course, the less power is stored in the battery, the less energy there is for the battery if it happens to, want to spontaneously combust. So, yeah, okay, I can see that, I guess. Finally, they recommend fully charged cycling the battery every 3 months in not use. And of course, this is good information or a good recommendation as well, simply because, well, if a battery like a lithium-ion battery charges enough, it will be permanently damaged. And I actually had this happen with, it also happens with nickel metal hydride batteries. I actually had this happen with nickel metal hydride batteries that I used to use in my splashes, and I didn't use them for about a year, came back to them, and most of them are pretty much shot at this point compared to what they were when I went and put them away. Now, all that said, here's my gripe. Good battery maintenance practices are always a good idea for optimizing your battery's life and longevity. However, Nobody, including DJI, makes doing this stuff easy or hands-free. There is no option in the app or on the gimbal itself to set a charge limit on the battery to 50%, or run an automated discharge routine to bring it down to either 50 or 30%, both of which DJI actually recommends doing. So, assuming you even bother to do any of this, you have to manage it all completely manually. And keep in mind that discharging a fully charged battery to 50% can take as long as 6 hours. Well, that's a lot of managing. Another friction point for me with the RS3 Pro is the quick release system. I like quick release systems, just not this one that much. So the main plate, or the bottom plate as DJI calls it, is very similar and mostly compatible with Manfrotto's 501PL style plates. However, it is not exactly one either. Now, part of that is the rack gear on it, and that makes it easier to balance the fine-tune the fore-aft balance of your camera rig, and that's fine. The other part, however, is that the dimensions that DJI used and the design of their quick-release locks makes it so that most plates won't actually work. So, like I said, on the gimbal, the rack is fantastic. It makes the adjustments that are needed for getting optimal balance dead simple. And on a gimbal, getting optimal balance is, well, ideal. It saves so much battery life by making the motors work less when it's actually doing things. In fact, I would go so far to say that I wish DJI had a similar rack system on the gimbal for all of the other axes that you need to balance for balancing, period. And some of them are really kind of awkward because it's just a carbon tube and a grip, or carbon fiber tube and a grip, and you actually have to like lift up on the camera to get it to slide easy, and having a gear would be really nice in that respect. However, on a regular Manfrotto style head, the DJI plates first of all have to be used backwards. This is because the rack gear would interfere with the safety stops on Manfrotto heads, so that's not really a problem. It just kind of does mean that the quick release part of the plate is in the front instead of the back, where it would be balanced better. The bigger problem, though, is the dimensioning situation. Now, due to the way most Manfrotto style heads work, the DJI plates work fine in them. However, due to the way DJI designed the locks on their heads, standard Manfrotto plates will not fit in the RS3 Pro. And I have tried both on-brand OEM, first-party Manfrotto plates, as well as third-party plates that are just sold as generic 501PL style plates. The same is actually true for the Arca Swiss style clamp on the back of the lower plate as well. DJI's riser plate works fine on their plate, and pretty much with any Arca Swiss style tripod head that I have tried it in. Of course, screw clamp types have a ton of margin and generally tend to work everywhere. However, I have yet to find an Arca Swiss style plate that actually works in the DJI clamp. Now, of course, if you don't use quick release plates on your cameras or cages, then you don't have a problem. You just screw the DJI stander off into the bottom of your tripod, or the tripod socket on the bottom of your camera, and you go from there. However, if you use an Arca Swiss style quick release plate, L plate, like the really right stuff ones that I have on my R5s, or a camera cage like the small rig ones that I have on my R5C, you'll want to get a replacement plate for the DJI lower that actually is compatible with a standard Arca style clamp or dovetail. Now, fortunately, really right stuff and small rig, I'm sure there are others out there. These are the two that I have and used, make DJI Manfrotto style to Arca Swiss adapters specifically for DJI's gimbals. Between the two, however, I do recommend the small rig plate over the really right stuff one, as the small rig plate includes everything, specifically the adjustment gear, which is the really right stuff one you need to take off of a DJI plate, and only certain ones will work. And it costs $70 less than the Really Right Stuff one. So it's cheaper and it has everything you need to get going. So with that, I want to take a second to talk a little bit about software on the side of things, because I've talked a lot about hardware. But let's talk about software and the associated DJI Ronin app. Now, I have one big complaint with the software situation on the RS3 Pro that isn't a deal breaker at all, but it just should not be a thing. There is an activation requirement and an account requirement. Now, this is a standalone piece of hardware. Moreover, there are no regulatory situations. It's not like a drone where you can have changing regulation that change airspace rules and requirements and so forth. So you might need to have a regulatory update system and accountability and whatnot. But that's not an issue here. However, there is a 5-use activation requirement. So you can only use the RS3 Pro 5 times before activating it. And to activate it, you have to have an account with DJI. So another site that has your username or email and passwords and blah, blah, blah. And I just don't understand why this needs to be there or why they need to do this. I mean, after all, I don't need an account with Nikon, Canon, or Sony to get firmware updates for my cameras. So why should I need one to get firmware updates for a standalone piece of gimbal hardware? That said, and aside from that gripe, the software I find works generally really well. It gets out of the way, it does what it needs to do, it works fine, the performance is generally on par, or it stabilizes, it does everything just fine. That said, if there are two places in the software that I think things could be improved. So first, there is no way to quickly toggle the function of the front dial. So on my gimbal, I have mine set up to use control focus through the camera through the USB connection with the camera. However, if I have a zoom lens mounted and I want to control it as well, I can use the DJI focusing motor to drive that. But I can't choose to have both running. And to change them, you have to go through the touch interface, and it's kind of a bit of a pain. What it'd be nice to have is a button that I can hit or hold that modifies the dial's function between, whatever two things you specify, so that you can go from camera focus to focus motor control, or focus motor control to roll control, or something like that, without having to go through menus. Now, the other limitation or oddity in the software is pano mode. And I hate to say that it shouldn't be there, but I really find that it's more than a gimmick than anything that's truly useful. To start with, it's not designed for the camera to be vertically oriented. When you specify a focal length and frame size, it doesn't calculate vertical, it calculates horizontal, and that's just how it rolls. Now, generally, when you shoot panos, and I really should do a video on this, but especially single roll panos, but almost always in general, you shoot vertical orientation. Now, the second problem that I've run into is parallax. So when shooting a pano, ideally, you're going to rotate the camera and lens around the lens's no parallax point. What this is technically called is irrelevant. The point is that it is the point in the optical path of the lens where no parallax occurs. Now, this ensures that everything you shoot stitches properly without errors. However, when you're balancing a camera on a gimbal, you balance it so that it rotates around the camera and lens's center of mass. And these 2 points, the no parallax point and the center of mass, are not going to be the same. Now, granted, modern pano stitching software is really good at dealing with these kinds of problems, usually, but they're not infallible. And in my testing, as long as your pano is shot of stuff all off in the distance and the angular coverage that you're using is fairly small, say less than about 180 degrees, things work fine. But once you go really wide, so your pano is covering more than 180 degrees, or you have detail that's both close up and far away, well, then stitching errors become more common and more of a problem. So with that said, this brings me to sort of the end of talking about the hardware. But I want to wrap this up with some thoughts on intangibles. Not specifically the hardware, but just kind of gimbals in general. And ultimately sort of poke at whether you really need a gimbal or not, and whether you should consider buying one. So one thing I haven't talked about in this video so far is technique. And unlike a small, ultralight integrated gimbal like DJI's Osmo series, there is very much a technique for using something like this, and it is something that needs to be practiced to get good at. This ranges from how you walk to become more stable and therefore get the smoothest images, to how you plan and work through holding it for a move so that you can move through your entire move without tripping over your own 2 feet or tying your arms up in a knot. Basically, it's not just it's there and it works. And the same, I could say, sort of goes for those fitness considerations that I talked about earlier as well. You don't have to be a strong man or super fit or anything like that to run a gimbal like this. But you certainly will do much better if you have the back, shoulder, and upper arm strength to do it, to do long isometric holds at about 10 or 15 pounds. Barring that, or actually not even barring that, considering even if you are going that way, but you plan to use this a lot, it might be a very good idea to look into options for added support. Vests, belts, straps, an actual Steadicam arm, that kind of thing, just to make things less wear and tear on your body. Now, another thing to keep in mind also is that the more complexity you throw into the equation, the harder it is to operate solo. Now, DJI does have some features that can help with this, such as the active track capabilities if you have the Ronin image transmitter or the LiDAR units or the focus unit. That can help with this, but in my experience, they are not infallible either. And now you're talking about going from like focus and composition to focus, composition, driving the gimbal through the stick and all of that. And yes, you can get good at it, you can practice it, but keep in mind that it does add more complexity. Now, all that said, I've also found that a gimbal is not a panacea, one-size-fits-all solution for everything either. Specifically, if you shoot a lot of product scale work, say computer camera size things, whether you're doing this for advertising, reviews, or just the part of the content you make revolves around stuff that size, I found that a gimbal isn't going to give you nearly as smooth of a move as you might expect, and certainly as you would see if you were shooting larger things like people or cars. Remember, a gimbal can't remove lateral shake. It works pan, tilt, and roll, but not through space. And this movement is magnified the smaller the subject is and the tighter you have to shoot it, the more magnification your lens is going to apply. Now, that said, there are definitely places where a gimbal absolutely shines and is by far the right tool for the job. And the RS3 Pro can easily fit into really most of those roles. You can go from gimbal on a stick to a ringed gimbal setup to the gimbal on a Steadicam arm to using it as a motion control head on a crane to mounting it to a car or boat to get stable imagery from that kind of platform. And quite honestly, that is incredibly powerful and useful, especially if you are a low-budget content creator or cinematographer. But the reality is that, like many things on the higher end of filmmaking, the gear doesn't do it all for you. You play an important part in the operation of, as well as the just working it. So whether you're considering an RS3 Pro or even any of the smaller camera-centric style gimbals, This is something you should be aware of and expect to spend time working on and practicing before you're going to get really good with it. But ultimately, here's the deal. If you're just looking for a way to get your handheld shots to shake less, a gimbal can definitely help, especially if you move through the scene. But it's not, in my experience at least, as simple as just throwing your camera on it and being done and acting like you're going to get professional results right away. Now this applies doubly so if you are doing mostly static handheld shots, where you're not moving around in a scene. In many of those situations, you will be better off with a monopod or a better grip solution that allows you to move your hands further away from the camera instead of spending money on adding a gimbal to your arsenal. Now, as with most of my reviews, I don't really do recommendations. Instead, I try to wrap things up by asking and answering the question, would I buy this again? Now, it probably shouldn't be too unexpected that my answer here is, in fact, yes. Now, granted, I also now understand that a gimbal wouldn't solve some of the problems that I had hoped it would. But perhaps the most telling point to me is that in the research I did, both as little as I did when I was buying this, as well as checking on some things now and putting this video together, I couldn't find a better option out there, at least not in this price range. Not something that had the ecosystem, flexibility, capability, etc. that the RS3 Pro has. So with that said, if you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button and sharing this. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Also, if you'd like to directly support this content and future content like it, please consider hitting that thanks button if you can, or buying yourself something you've always wanted from an affiliate link in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.